Howdy folks, I'm Colonel Sanders and you're not. This video I wanted to talk and touch base on the history with Uncle Harley visiting different franchisees and what he would do to make sure that his quality was being kept up to standards. The first thing that he did when he walked into a restaurant was reach his hand, grab a fistful of flour, squeeze it, and if it made a cob in his hand, he knew it was the right kind of flour. Last year I had no idea what kind of flour was used, and after talking to several different people and finally getting to the right people that knew Uncle Harley and worked in the early days of Kentucky Fried Chicken that's still around today, we learned that they use cake flour. He used cake flour. It was very fine flour. That was the key to getting it golden brown as well in the amount of time that it took to cook it. You use a very fine type of flour like cake flour, your chicken will come out brown. The texture of it will be slightly different than what you're used to with extra crispy. So people would add, franchisees would add an extra 2 pounds, 3 pounds of flour to the mix to stretch out the ingredients. Or they would use a different type like whole wheat flour, a thicker flour, to stretch out the ingredients and make them last longer so they didn't have to reorder the spice blend as often as they had to. Uncle Harley believed that this depreciated the value of his product that he had to sell. I see at the time, the family, Cousin Lee, Claudia, and mainly Claudia, because Cousin Lee was helping franchise Kentucky Fried Chicken across the country with the Colonel. They would mix and supply the recipe. On the back porch, they had this big metal drum and a snow shovel, and they would get the ratios that were needed, and they would mix it inside the giant drum. Now, whether Claudia knew part of it, Lee knew part of it, Uncle Jim knew part of it, I don't know if it was split up between all of them, or if they all gatherly knew it. The story is that they all knew it and they took it with them to the grave. But anyway, so they would mix that in the big drum with the snow shovel. They would package that, and then that would be how the franchisees got their spice blend. They got their mixes. So when Uncle Harley and the family were providing that, before any company was providing it, they didn't want to reorder it as often for some of the franchisees. So they make some changes to the flour, and they would either change it from cake flour to a different flour or add a few extra pounds of flour to stretch out the ingredients. And that's why at some of those locations, it didn't taste right. It depreciated the flavor of the chicken because then the ratios from spice blend to flour were not accurate. And therefore, it changed the recipe and made some changes to it. And Uncle Harley got very fussy over that. Rightfully so. I today would get fussy over that if I went to a franchise and they were doing that to cut corners. And this is something that goes on today. They don't use cake flour anymore today, but they stretch out the ingredients. I believe that some franchisees that just want to cut corners and get done with the day, they stretch out the ingredients with extra pounds of flour. That's what Uncle Harley's biggest complaint was with franchisees, both when he owned the business and after he sold it, where franchisees wanted to cut corners. They didn't want to do things right. They wanted to make changes that they believed were better and faster for the company. So that's when you go to a restaurant today and the chicken just doesn't taste like that there's any spice there and it just tastes like salt. That's why, is because they're stretching out the ingredients throughout the flour with extra pounds of flour. See, the salt is now in the spice blend mix. It wasn't before. Uncle Harley would mix the 11 herbs and spices. He'd have those made. And then you add salt to the flour. And he had specific ingredients and brands of the salt and the flour. And he would provide the seasonings. And he would have explicit instructions on how to mix it with the flour. And he always added the salt after the spice blend was mixed with the flour. So, but anyways, they might be doing that. They stretch out the ingredients and then they just add some extra salt to it. That's highly likely at these locations that aren't doing things right. Now, I don't travel around to make sure Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants are doing it right. I don't even work for the brand. For 8 years, I spoke out against them because of the quality that I had at several locations in Florida and the treatment that I had online from their social team and their advertisements disrespecting my family. But in April of this year, they proved to me that they still do things good. They can still do things good, and they're committed to keeping the history alive. Because in April, KFC invited my family out to Corbin, and we had a great time. We made up all that stuff's behind us. But that doesn't change the fact of the history and what Uncle Harley thought and said and did. And so, rightfully so, you can understand why he was fussy about the flour not being right. The next thing he didn't like was the gravy changing. And by changing, I think they started, I don't know what year they actually started dehydrating it. And there's nothing really wrong with dehydrated potatoes, instant mashed potatoes, or the dehydrated gravy. You just add water to it. And if you do it right, you don't rush through it, you do the right ratio, it comes out great. Because it's the same thing, it just comes out great. But people weren't doing it just right. And Uncle Harley didn't like the changes that they were making. And they call it slop and throw it in the trash. There was one story, a franchisee was having their employees set up all the sides, the coleslaw, the mashed potatoes, the gravy, all on a counter, ready to go out instead of making it fresh each time. And Uncle Harley took his cane and said, not today. Swiped it off the counter into the trash and said, you're going to make it from scratch today. And they did. They made it from scratch. So, I just wanted to touch base on some of that stuff. There's some things I don't know. And there's some more things to learn. And I do a lot of research on this. I don't have to do it, but I do. I do a lot of research on this because I want to understand myself what Uncle Harley went through and what the franchisees went through when he was alive. And that to me is important to know when talking about things, because if someone brings something up and I don't know about it, I have to say I don't know about it. So I'd like to know about it. It's an important note that just because you're born in the family doesn't mean you're born with the knowledge. I had to have the want to learn. So I had the willingness and the want to learn. And that's what I do.